Hi, and welcome to Eminent Americans. I'm your host, Dan Oppenheimer, Little Prince of the contemporary American intellectual scene. My guest on the show today is Greg Barnhizel, who is an English professor at Duquesne University and author of the recent book Codename Puritan, Norman Holmes Pearson at the Nexus of Poetry, Espionage, and American Power. Our conversation is in one sense about the subject of Greg's book, Norman Holmes Pearson, who is a pioneer of a few distinct American establishments, or distinct but overlapping, including the intelligence establishment, the American studies establishment, the modernist poetry establishment, and the sort of trade publishing establishment. So it's about him, but it's also, and maybe more, about the death of what Pearson represented or embodied, which is the American Cold War establishment, also the kind of American blue blood, WASP, Yankee establishment. And maybe if we abstract even further the conversations about the death of any unitary establishment in America whatsoever that possesses the power to author a consensus or narrative to which most of the nation will defer. And it's also about one of my abiding preoccupations as a proud but also somewhat tortured son of New England with the old Yankee WASP elite culture, which I've been in the vicinity of, but not quite of, for much of my life. A bit of housekeeping before I get to the conversation. At some point in the relatively near future, probably September or October, I'm planning to launch another newsletter and podcast, and this one will focus on the book that I'm now writing with my wife, Jessica Grogan, who is a couples therapist. We're calling the book and the Substack The Good Enough Marriage, and it's about relationships, romance, couples therapy, American culture, all of the good things. So we'll be writing about those things, about those topics, and we'll also be talking to various people who have interesting things to say in those realms. It's to be determined what shape this will take. We don't want to overpromise, just kind of given everything else going on in our life. So I don't know how frequently we'll write and podcast, but frequently enough to make it worth subscribing if that's stuff that you're interested in. And I will let you know as it develops, and I will certainly be cross-posting stuff from over there on this feed when it doesn't feel like too much of a stretch. So I'm pretty excited about it. I think it'll be interesting. I think it'll feed productively into this stuff as well. So on to the conversation with Greg Barnhizel. Hope you enjoy. I know I did. Greg Barnhizel, welcome to Eminent Americans. You are hereby anointed an eminent American by the power vested in me by X2, the counter-espionage wing of the OSS, the predecessor to the CIA. Welcome to the show. Good to have you.
Oh, it's great to be here. It's great to be here. I'm a faithful listener, and you get a really nice variety of guests on here, so I always like hearing who you get on there.
You're on the show to talk about your new book, Codename Puritan, Norman Holmes Pearson at the Nexus of Poetry, Espionage, and American Power. The challenge of our episode today is not to make the case that your book is a good book, which it is. It's to have a conversation that feels relevant to people on a podcast about the contemporary American intellectual scene. I will put that to you in, 2 minutes or less. Tell me why your book is of relevance to people, the small but elite X2-like cadre of people who listen to Eminent Americans. So go.
Among all the other real horrors of what's been going on the past 110 days or whatever, one nice thing is it's given me
I don't know what you're talking about. What happened to 100?
Yeah. It's given me an opportunity to sort of rethink what the book's contribution to the contemporary scene really is, because it's a biography of a man named Norman Holmes Pearson, who was a Yale English professor who also spent several years in the American intelligence services during the Second World War, and then after the war became part of this agglomeration of powerful American institutions that included higher education and the national security agencies, State Department, foundations, the business world, and all that, who were acting in concert to promote American interests in the Cold War. And my argument is that while Pearson is not a particularly well-known figure now, nor was he of the status of somebody like a Dulles brother or Mac Bundy or somebody like that, he's probably the emblematic figure of this kind of American century. But as we've watched, I say that this fell apart, this kind of cultural consensus fell apart during Vietnam. And it sort of did in the sense of having almost universal public buy-in. What we've seen in the last 100 days is the kind of deliberate dismantling of every last remnant of that. And to really bring it up to the present, last week, Joseph Nye, who was a kind of scholar, an important thinker about culture diplomacy, passed away. And he had coined the term called soft power, which was the ability for nations to persuade without force. And his scholarly work and his work as a mentor to many diplomats was to say, the United States needs to use its soft power because its soft power they have more soft power than anyone else in the world. And then last week, Joseph Stiglitz died, who was also an important figure in the kind of scholarship of cultural diplomacy. And that the current administration has not just dismantled it, but has said like soft power is anathema to what we're trying to do. And so as we built up, and in many ways that were not great for the country and that were not great for those of us who hold sort of liberal or even lefty values, had built up this alliance between the media, national security agencies, higher education, all these things that got us into a lot of disasters like Vietnam. But it had a lot of other positive effects on our society and culture. And that this administration has come in with the explicit plan to tear all that down has really it's given a new dimension of relevance to Pearson's life, I think, as one of, if not the architects, then one of the foremen of building up this structure that, for all of its flaws, really defended liberal values, the rule of law, pluralism, democracy, and because Pearson was always a republic, capitalism.
I'm interested in getting into Pearson, but I kind of think I want to, as you were talking, I kind of think I want to back into who he was specifically by way of kind of understanding this world better. Because one of the things I was thinking as you were talking about, the deterioration, the dissipation, the rejection of this kind of infrastructure of soft power is we're also in the middle of a deep challenge to the narratives that held it together, and things like American exceptionalism and a belief in American virtue, ideas of, bringing democracy to, all the corners of the globe. And so that's under challenge too. But the other thing that I think is interesting, and one of the things that's such a challenge for good left liberals like you and me in thinking about the deterioration of the elite and of these institutions, is that there are a lot of aspects of them that sit very uneasily with our kind of baseline democratic ethos. You end up having to ask yourself questions that are not easy to sort of answer in good conscience from a democratic perspective. Like, what needs to be secret? Do we need to accept that in every society there is going to be an elite who wields extraordinary power relative to the median citizen? And if so, then do we have to ask ourselves unpleasant questions about what should the nature of that elite be? And then you get into questions about espionage and intelligence and intervention in other parts of the world. And this is very relevant to Pearson. And then, you get into these sort of post-Cold War issues around the kind of secret promotion of American culture, pop culture, high culture, through journals, through exhibitions, through the sponsorship of scholarships and all sorts of things, right? And all of these things that part of us likes, we think maybe broad perpetuation of American power and American values is on balance a good thing. But these are not democratic mechanisms always in the purest sense. So I guess respond to that, but also more to the point of your book, like, how do these people understand themselves and what they were doing and what their values were, and how they sort of negotiated these kind of intrinsic tensions?
That's a great place to start. So Pearson came from old New England stock, and his family descended from Mayflower passengers, and even from his mother came from Elder William Brewster, descendant of Elder William Brewster. And although Pearson was not part of the real elite of that Massachusetts class, Cabots and Lowells, et cetera, he was sort of adjacent to them. His family were middle class and ran a department store in Gardner, Massachusetts, which is a factory town. And he attended public schools. But he eventually did a postgraduate year at Andover, and then he went to Yale, and so encountered a bunch of these people. And I would say this class, and when we talk about some of the actual names, it would be people like Mac Bundy and the Dulles brothers and people like that. And the Bushes, I often think of George H.W. Bush as this, saw themselves as these descendants of the New England early settlers, these early Puritans, these first families of Bostons, had a special responsibility to the nation. They had extraordinary power and influence, not always extraordinary money, but extraordinary power and influence over the culture and over Americans' self-conception of the stories of what makes us American. And they took for granted that those stories were based in New England. They were about the Puritans. They were about our roots in the United Kingdom. And they had a kind of noblesse oblige to them that to somebody like me who doesn't come from anything like that sort of background, that I find really aggravating and annoying. But I think they felt it earnestly. And of course, the drawbacks are we have to trust them. But there was a real sense of a public obligation that these people had that comes from Puritanism, promoting things like limited democracy, promoting things like self-control, restraint, capitalism, but not sort of extraordinary over-the-top wealth accumulation capitalism, all these values that we associate with the Puritans. So this class of people who have extraordinary power and influence over the United States culture and government from the start of the Republic well until the Second World War, and Pearson culturally is certainly part of them. Although he's not one of the people who's running the show in terms of being the Secretary of State, being the president of Yale, anything like that. He's the next rung down. But what he's doing as an academic, and you mentioned that he helped develop, when we talk about the exploitation of academia, he's one of the developers of the academic field of American studies. And so in the 1940s, he starts developing this field, particularly at Yale. The field quickly sets up schools of American studies in kind of Cold War flashpoint spots like Japan, West Germany, France, places like that. And Pearson is really helping to develop the curriculum where foreign leaders will learn about what the nature of the United States is. And for him, the nature of the United States is this story about New England Puritanism leading to this kind of liberal, pluralist, democratic, capitalist society that we have.
But then isn't it also, maybe this isn't going out through the American Studies departments, but through other channels. I mean, it's also modernist poetry. It's also jazz. It's also abstract expressionism. It's both this sort of austere story of like New England Puritanism, and then it's this very sexy story of like Hollywood and Jackson Pollock throwing paint on a canvas and kind of herky-jerky modernist poetry and things like that as well.
Yes. So, and that's actually what the topic of my previous book was about, oddly enough, is in the 1940s, when the United States becomes economically and militarily by far the dominant power in the world, but still not the dominant cultural power. And one of the arguments of the Communist International and the Cominform, the Soviet Union, is that, yeah, the United States may have a lot of economic and military power, but they got no culture. And there are a lot of sympathetic ears in France, in Germany, in Italy, hearing that. And so to counter that argument, the United States does start mounting this major cultural offensive saying, like, we are more than Hollywood and chewing gum and Bugs Bunny. We have Jackson Pollock. There's a wonderful book that many of your listeners may know called How New York Stole the Idea of Modern Art by Serge Guilbeault, which is about how the CIA and the State Department come in and start funding abstract expressionism and then sending it abroad to Europe to say, look what we got here. And Pearson is involved in that to some extent, but he's deeply involved in becoming a kind of fixer and agent, helping the careers of these American modernist artists whose work is so deeply respected by the European avant-garde. And in the 40s and 50s, and I'm talking specifically about people like Ezra Pound, Gertrude Stein, Hilda Doolittle, or H.D., he is instrumental in advancing their careers through these bureaucratic institutions that he inhabits, such as Yale, where he's collecting their works, but such as the State Department, where when he goes abroad and he's setting up American Studies classes, or he's doing guest lectures at a brand new university they just set up in Australia, he's talking about Pound and H.D. and William Carlos Williams and making a link that, this is American high culture. We are on the cutting edge. You cannot dismiss us as just military force and popular culture.
So we're deeply familiar, and I think ever more so these days, with the failures of the elites and elite institutions. But you're making the case, that there's aspects of these structures that we like. And one of them was the capacity, because they held such extraordinary cultural power, right? And that was lubricated with money and with political power and with wealth and things like that. Because they held such extraordinary cultural power, they were able to sort of sustain and propagate, both at home and abroad, a highbrow culture, a serious, substantive American culture that was so serious and substantive that even the sort of, naturally suspicious and skeptical Europeans were sort of forced to sort of bow to its power in some sense, or to respect its genius. And one of the things that's happened as those institutions have dissipated or fragmented, or in some ways, in some good ways, become more democratic, is that they've lost unitary hold on the sort of power, and they've also lost a sense of themselves or their responsibilities, I think, as supporting elite highbrow culture. Is that part of the case you would make for somebody like Pearson and for the world that he was a part of and that he helped both build and then sustain?
Yeah, and he was a believer in whatever these highly prestigious institutions that would confer a kind of legitimacy on, and if we're just going to talk about art, confer a kind of legitimacy on art. And these would be, I don't know, institutions like the Museum of Modern Art, right? The Museum of Modern Art in New York City, but also major publishing houses. So if an avant-garde writer like H.D., who has published most of her work with small underground places or little private presses and all that, one of the things that Pearson does, because he is a believer in these major institutions, is go to mainstream publishers like Macmillan and say, you need to start publishing these avant-garde writers. And Macmillan would say, no, these are a bunch of crazy bohemians. No one's going to buy this. But Pearson would say, through my power that I have through Yale, he was also a member of the American Academy of Poets. So he gets people these fellowships through the American Academy of Poets. So he leverages the power of these prestigious institutions and doesn't lend their prestige to these writers who are in the 40s and 50s quite disreputable, and in the case of Ezra Pound, actually an indicted traitor, and in the case of H.D., a sort of disreputable lesbian. He is able to use the cultural capital that these institutions possess to then convey that power and that cultural capital to these kind of like scruffy avant-garde writers. And then the interesting thing is he maintains his role at the middle of these very conservative institutions of prestige, but he's always trying to keep up with what's new, what's happening. So one of the more fun things that I run across recently is I have a dissertation student who's writing his dissertation on this New York underground figure called Ed Sanders. And Ed Sanders ran a magazine. He was the head of a band called the Fugs in the Lower East Side. He ran a magazine called Fuck You, a magazine of the arts, just a total sort of like out there East Village character. And then I run across all of these correspondence between Sanders and Pearson, the minute he hears about Fuck You, a magazine of the arts, he writes him on his Yale stationery. He's like, I want a whole run of this thing. Send it up here. Let's talk. So he's always trying to be on the cutting edge of things. And one of the reasons, and just as a side note for the lit crit nerds among your listenership, is his approach to literature and literary study is very culturally and historically informed. And those of your listeners who know about the history of literary criticism, is the mid-century was the heyday of what's called the new criticism, which is don't look at anything outside the text. And so anything about history or biography or culture is verboten in talking about the text. So Pearson gets very marginalized at Yale being ground zero for the new criticism.
And then later, like deconstruction, right?
Yeah. He's there as deconstruction kind of takes over. He's really not on the outs by then, but he's on the back end of his career, and he's spending most of his time at that point doing bureaucratic things like running the American Studies Association. But yeah, when there's a great photograph that's in my book of the 1967 Yale English department faculty, which is about 30 men in three-piece wool suits, one woman, nobody of color, and then two Jewish professors. Pearson's all the way on the very end, right next to Harold Bloom. The two sort of like guys on the outs.
I was an undergrad at Yale in the mid 90s, and I romanticize it in this sense. This is going to make sense in the context of Pearson, which was, it was a very liberal place, and it was a sort of very like, I think the best version of a kind of incrementalist, reformist, elite institution, right? So there was no energy, as there has been in more recent years, there was no energy of like tear it all down. The students were pretty apolitical. It was a place that kind of embraced moderate, liberal multiculturalism, right? So it had all of these elite traditions, and you saw all of these elite traditions that then assimilated in this pretty frictionless way a very different demographic. So you still have Skull and Bones. Everybody's in Skull and Bones, still loves the fact that they're in Skull and Bones. But the demographics, it's not that picture of a bunch of white guys in three-piece suits. Like, it's a rainbow coalition. It's a Benetton ad. You've got the one or two gay students. You've got three or four black students, an Hispanic student, an Asian student. You've got the person who's the social justice activist in town. And you've got the captain of the football team who's a buff white dude. And then there's a place like Maury's is a famous like private club in New Haven where students would go and they'd get a private room, and there were all these traditions, and you'd sing songs and drink these funny drinks and things like that. But again, all of these different looking groups, but of course, all of these different looking groups, each of whom in their own way was utterly elite, right? And you're talking about Pearson. I think at one point you say he was a man of his time, or always slightly ahead of his time, right? And that's like,
but never that far.
But never that far. But that's exactly what a lot of these places are, a lot of these liberal institutions are. I guess if we're being generous, what they are is at their best is of their time, but a little bit ahead of their time. They find these very smooth ways to integrate new currents. And I think Pearson was kind of emblematic of that, right? I mean, and even from a very early age, he was interested in, some women writers in a way that a lot of his peers weren't. And he's kind of slowly, incrementally incorporating Black writers, Hispanic writers, more women writers into his curriculum, into the kinds of people he's supporting. But he's doing it in this very reformist, incrementalist, liberal way. You say, I think towards the end, that he probably wouldn't be a big fan of the current instantiation of American studies because it is no longer that, right? It's more of a kind of radical, race, class, gender, rejectionist in terms of American empire, in terms of capitalism, in terms of kind of mainstream American institutions. He was a devout believer in those things, but also somebody who implicitly or explicitly thought that they needed to keep incorporating energy from the margins and people from the margins in order to maintain their own vitality.
Yeah, he was a profound liberal in that sense. He came from this WASPy, both philosophical and actual class background, but he very much felt that this kind of growing a term that they didn't use at the time that we use now, this growing diversity of American culture was a good thing, but he liked it in dribs and drabs. His class would always run things, right? He took for granted that this class would always run things, and that was kind of the way it was always going to be. But that it was really energizing to the American project, both writ large as a culture, and also writ small, as in Yale University, which was the place where he was at home, to bring in, with a few Black students. And I'm going to now have a class that I actually teach 2 or 3 novels written by people of color. And we may get into this a little bit later, but starting in the 1960s, he started work as a cultural diplomat. So they would the State Department would send him abroad, and he would be helping to set up these American studies programs, but also speaking on behalf of the Department of State. And the last trip he took was to Seoul for an American Studies conference in 1975. And the last public address he ever gave was about this idea of changing concepts of democracy, which was almost a kind of melting pot argument that bringing these other populations, non-white people and women, into full citizenship and giving people, if not, an equal voice in culture to these kind of elites, but a significant voice in culture, would continue to renew the American project. So it is a deeply liberal attitude that he has. It's hard to predict exactly what he would do, but I cannot imagine that he would have any sympathy to this much, much harder edge identity politics that have really come to characterize, in particular in academia, like the American Studies Association.
Right, of all places. Yeah, that's a funny inversion with American Studies, given its origins and the sort of beliefs of the people who founded it. I mean, it's fun. I was going to say, I think you're right. By the same token, my read on him from your book is temperamentally, yes, he thought that as long as it was still run by his class, but that he probably would have been able to sort of relatively easily assimilate a shift in what his class meant. That as long as the ethos was kind of the same and the structures were the same, which is in fact what, and in this sense, things haven't changed that much, which is actually what I think the elite universities and foundations and, journalistic organizations basically are. Would he have really had a problem if the Yale Corporation, the board, was diverse racially, religiously, sexually.
No, as long as they God, country, and Yale.
As long as there was, as long as they were still sending out their people with this kind of broad mission. I mean, and I think like one of the things that's happening now, one of the things that's coming from this sort of populist energy on the right and populist attack on the right is an attack on both of these strands and often a conflation of them that sometimes is justified and sometimes isn't, right? But the attack on the university is both an attack on the kind of anti-capitalist identity politics beliefs of American studies, of the ethnic studies departments, of probably a healthy dose of, in the English department and in anthropology and in some of other liberal arts and social sciences departments. But it is also an attack on this utterly American establishment, capitalistic, institutionalist strain too, which the universities had done a pretty good job of integrating or accommodating for a long time. And I think now, in light of these attacks, it's bringing to the fore some of these tensions, right? Like, does the kind of old school, not old school, but sort of descended from the old school liberal establishment that's really truly running places like Harvard and Yale and the New York Times and probably the MacArthur Foundation and the Ford Foundation, like, are they willing to throw over these more left-wing aspects of the institution in order to preserve some of their influence and power?
That's just a fantastic question. And
Pearson probably would have been, because he was comfortable in his dislike of those parts, right? And one of the things that's changed is that a lot of those tensions and those contradictions have been submerged. The center of power, the people who hold the purse strings and the high office, have been able to pretend to themselves that they're all on the same team. I think this is my hypothesis. He wasn't pretending to himself. Like, he was a proud cold warrior. Like, he was comfortable saying, like, well, I'm pro-capitalist. I don't like people who believe in maybe I'll defend their right to speak in the context of the First Amendment, but I think they're un-American. I don't think much of them.
Yeah, and he died while Yale was still, like, the institutions of Yale and Harvard and all that were still very much with him. It took a while for Yale to get, and these other institutions to get as liberal and even beyond liberal, lefty as they got. It started to happen in the late 60s. People who have these more leftist beliefs start to filter into the higher levels of the institutions later in the 70s, and then, of course, in the 80s. He dies in 75. I don't think he could have imagined that. I mean, the problem was always that Yale was too conservative. That Yale was, certainly in the 60s, was when the American Studies program was founded at Yale, when they got the money from William Robertson Coe in 1950, the president of Yale came out and said, like, the purpose of this department is to confront communism. It was not about teaching students or producing research. It was to confront communism. And the faculty members of that department were entirely on board with that ideological project. And that held through the 60s. And I've spoken to many of the men, of course, because it was all male, who were students in the American Studies department in the 60s. And there were some that kind of dissented. There were some that said, no, we shouldn't be as embroiled in the Cold War project as we are. But most were definitely on board with it. And as we all know, Yale was the great nursery of spies. Yale was the place that you went from Yale to CIA. That's where you went. And Pearson, he was reputed for basically all of his career at Yale to be an active CIA agent, which I don't think was true. You
think he was kind of a loose talent spotter for them, right?
He was definitely a talent spotter. I don't know how long he did it. Certainly, he was asked, and maybe we'll get into later what his wartime experience was, but after the Second World War, when he had been serving in a high intelligence position, he was asked, rather than going back to Yale, to be the founding director of counterintelligence at Central Intelligence Agency, and he turned it down to go back to Yale. But he definitely not only recruited Yale students, and I know exactly what the P.O. box was that he would send their names to. And I know some of the people that he recruited, including many of your listeners will know Peter Matthiessen, one of the founders of the Paris Review, who was one of the people that Pearson recruited in. Not necessarily because he was the most promising spy, but largely because Pearson was always a networker, because Peter Matthiessen was the nephew of the great literary critic F.O. Matthiessen, who Pearson adored. But we definitely know that he was a recruiter during that whole time. I don't think that he was actually doing any other kind of piecework, but I could be wrong.
So he dies in 75, but that brings us up through Vietnam. It brings us up through a lot of CIA shenanigans in various parts of the world, particularly in Latin America, where he's not directly involved in those efforts, but he's certainly aware of what's going on. And one would think, I guess I'm wondering how introspective he was, it would pose a challenge to the sort of, I'm not sure if to his conscience is the right way to put it. Was he troubled at all, or was he just a kind of true blue cold warrior in the sense that, like, we're preserving the free world, and, you need to break some eggs to make an omelet?
That's one of the questions that I really tried to answer in this. And so ironically, the man wrote so much. I mentioned earlier that he was a compulsive networker, and he was a compulsive collector of everything, including people. And so we have, which made this a pretty easy, not an easy biography to write, but easier biography to write than it might be, because he collected everything and kept all of his stuff and wrote everything. So there's just so much documentation of his day-to-day life. But he didn't tip his hand about his opinions all that often, very infrequently. And the one person that he would open up to about politics was a woman named Breyer, who was the life partner of the poet H.D., with whom Pearson was so close. And Breyer was this British aristocrat, but also a kind of like sexual rebel, genderqueer, like avant-garde artist, totally out there, all that kind of stuff, and also just a reactionary, arch reactionary. And so the two of them, in a British sense, like a worshiper of Churchill and hater of the Labour governments. But so the only place that you can really find Pearson expressing opinions on political matters is in his extensive correspondence with Breyer. And so I read that very avidly, especially some of the questions that I wanted to find out was exactly that. So when the CIA is getting up to all these shenanigans in first of all, the kind of overthrowing of the governments in the 50s, then Bay of Pigs, then all the revelations of the secret funding of things like the Congress for Cultural Freedom and the National Student Organization. I want to know what he thinks about that. I also want to know what he thinks about Kim Philby, because he worked very closely with Kim Philby.
The spy,
yeah, when he was in the Second World War. He almost never talks about it, and he almost never expresses any opinion on anything. My gut sense is that he would be exactly what you said, like, you got to break some eggs to make an anti-communist omelet. What he did like commenting on was a kind of inside baseball tradecraft. So when he talked about the revelations about the secret payments to the cultural organizations, there was nothing about the morality of it, nothing about the wisdom of it, about whether or not it would work. He was just disgusted at the tradecraft that they would leave enough threads that people could figure it out. Like, he was disappointed in them as a professional.
Was he getting CIA money for the American Studies work, or State Department? Well, obviously he was getting some State Department, like explicit State Department money. Was he getting secret government money?
No, I have no idea.
Because he left no traces, because his tradecraft was so superior.
No one that I know of among the scholars and journalists has been able to find CIA money going to the academic programs. It goes to other things. It definitely goes to other things. It goes to nonprofits. It goes to cultural organizations. It goes to magazines. We don't have evidence of it going to American Studies academic programs, which doesn't mean it didn't happen. I tried to trace that as much as possible. Obviously, I FOIA'd CIA, I FOIA'd FBI, and I got a cannot confirm or deny. Searched his archive very, very carefully. Nothing in there. But he scrubbed it before he gave it to Yale. And then after he died, CIA and the National Archives scrubbed it, because when he died, all of his OSS work was still classified. So that had to get taken out. And then, of course, everything CIA had to get taken out. So I have no idea what might be there or what might not be there. The OSS stuff was restored to it when they declassified all that at the end of the 1970s. So all of that material is in there. And it's also the original documents, which are super interesting, are in the National Archives. So I was able to consult that. But in terms of the CIA stuff, no, I don't know about that. But definitely State Department money, definitely Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, private people like William Robertson
Coe. But that was all on that was all above board. I mean, there was nothing secret about that. There was
no. There were big congressional hearings they had congressional hearings in the 50s about, we have to establish American Studies academic departments abroad.
Let's talk about the spy stuff. So what is it that prepared this guy who, I'm not sure we brought this up, but who suffered a terrible injury when he was 8 years old? He fell off the roof of a barn, was kind of disabled ever after, an unlikely spy master. How did he end up, writing a lot of the rules for counterespionage for American intelligence?
Yeah, it was fairly, as you say, it was fairly unlikely because, first of all, the United States had never really had any kind of civilian intelligence agency. There had briefly been one in the First World War that got dismantled after the war ended, but we didn't have a civilian intelligence agency. And so just before the Second World War started, when it became clear that there was going to be a war and the United States was probably going to be involved in it, Roosevelt had given some money to General Wild Bill Donovan, who had been a general in the First World War, to start a civilian intelligence agency, which he called the Office of Special Services, the OSS. It was originally just an intelligence gathering and analysis operation, signals intelligence, but also, just any kind of intelligence. And so they set up their offices in Washington, and they were just kind of sifting through every kind of raw information. And so a lot of academics got recruited into that, especially after the war started, because they were really good at analyzing scraps of information. And there have been a number of good books about that. Book and Dagger by a scholar named Elise Graham, which is a really fun, well-written, it's about scholars in the Secret War. Anyway, I recommend it to your listeners. But so Pearson gets recruited into there because he's good at analyzing texts. But he's also, as I mentioned before, he's a kind of compulsive networker, and he's a glad hander, and he's really great at cultivating people. And so they see that, and the higher ups at the OSS say, well, we need a counterintelligence agency. So counterintelligence, for your listeners, means finding out who's spying on you and stopping them from doing that. So the United States doesn't have anything of the sort. The Brits do. The United States needs this because, of course, now we have spy problems. But also, and this is, I found this sort of interesting. I didn't know this before I started the work on this book. Your listeners may be familiar with the German Enigma coding machine and that the heroic efforts to crack the code by Alan Turing and others at the Bletchley Park compound, which was the subject of the movie, the Imitation Game. But so the Brits had they knew everything the Germans were doing because they would send it on the Enigma machine. And the Germans didn't know the Brits had the codes. The United States, after we got in the war, wanted that intelligence. Or they knew there was something going on. They knew the Brits had access to some sort of intelligence gold mine. The Brits would not let go of it because they were afraid we would tip their hands and show the Germans that the codes have been broken. They said, well, the only way we'll give you something is if you create a very special branch of your new civilian intelligence agency and they're the only ones who can have this stuff, and they have to be the most trustworthy and judicious and careful people, and we have to approve them, and they have to work directly with us at all times. So that was this counterintelligence agency that Pearson had been asked to start. And so his job was to work very closely with the Brits. And as I mentioned earlier, his primary contact, his counterpart, was Kim Philby, oddly enough, who was passing everything on to the Soviets at the same time.
At least he wasn't passing it on to the Germans, though.
At least he wasn't. He hated the Germans. But so that's what Pearson did during the war, is he headed X2.
Because he was a good analyst of texts, because he was socially adept and kind of good at networking. He seemed trustworthy. He was identified as the person to lead this group, not because he struck people as some, just sort of preternatural capacity for espionage and counter-espionage, but because he seemed, almost in a bureaucratic sense, like the right person to run this outfit.
Yeah. And as I'm sure your listeners will have noticed, there's a big theme going through this about bureaucratic institutions, right? Bureaucratic institutions. And so Pearson, because of this injury that he suffered when he was very young, and so he wasn't able to live the kind of boisterous physical outdoor life that a young boy would have lived in the early part of the 20th century, he learned how to operate through bureaucratic institutions, starting in the small town ones, his church and his school and his dad's department store and all that, and all through Yale and all that. So he's very skilled at cultivating people. He's a great networker, but he also is extremely good at working within bureaucratic institutions. So yeah, that's what lands him here. And he's also just smart as hell and a very good analyst of text and drawing connections between things. And because he ends up becoming the head of X2, so he's not doing a lot of primary spy work himself. He's certainly not doing anything in the field. But because of his experience as a teacher, he was great at teaching other people. And so he was great at developing the agents who were actually working in the field and teaching them the principles of counterintelligence, counterespionage that he had learned from the Brits, because we didn't have any of of that kind of infrastructure in the United States. He had learned that from the Brits and then kind of tinkered with it. And eventually, the curriculum that he developed for teaching people how to do counterespionage and counterintelligence was adopted by the Central Intelligence Agency. If Pearson wouldn't work here, they were at least going to use his curriculum.
I remember reading, I think this is in Witness, in Whittaker Chambers' autobiography, and he was talking about, he was a spy, and I think primarily in D.C. in the 1930s. He ultimately was working for the Soviets, and he's kind of imagining that the Americans likely have a counterespionage infrastructure, and so in order to maintain secrecy and hand off the intelligence that he was gathering in a way, I mean, he would just engage in these pretty elaborate, I mean, on the one hand, elaborate rituals, on the other hand, not elaborate at all if you assume that somebody's trying to catch you. And he writes about how he found out later that, like, nobody was trying to catch him. Like, they didn't have the people. They didn't have the expertise. They weren't, and maybe they were starting to establish it, but he would get on a tram and then get off and then walk a mile and then, change his jacket and all of these things that was presuming people who were trained in detecting spies, and they just didn't exist. And it's interesting going back to the origins of these things, whether it's in the United States or the Soviet Union or Great Britain, because at this point we've had a pretty mature, sophisticated intelligence infrastructure for my entire life and your entire life. And so it seems eternal. My default assumption is a kind of like optimization. Like, this is the way it must be, right? These are the most sophisticated techniques. This is the way it must be. It must have evolved in this extraordinarily efficient, sophisticated way. But of course, at the beginning, it's just a bunch of dudes trying to figure out how to do this thing, right? And and they can call on the Brits, but it's not like the British intelligence infrastructure is that old either. It's probably, if it's older than ours, it's probably by a decade or two or three or something like that, right? And so they were a bunch of dudes. So we're learning from a bunch of dudes who've been doing it for 10 or 20 years longer than we have. And you're just creating these infrastructures, and the person who's helping to do it is an English major. It's not somebody who trained in it because there was nothing to train in.
Yeah, so the thing with Whittaker Chambers, I mean, it's fascinating because they, in the first years of counterintelligence, and so Whittaker Chambers, it wouldn't be CIA who was after him, that would have been FBI. And of course, Hoover, has this vaunted intelligence director. He can catch everybody. No, he didn't know what he was doing there. And the guy in charge of, in those years, the guy in charge of counterintelligence at the Central Intelligence Agency was James Angleton, the famous James Angleton, who Pearson trained and had actually been Pearson's student at Yale. And Angleton was giving over everything he knew to Kim Philby because they would get drunk every afternoon at lunch.
I'm curious. This is a little bit in a different direction. Like you were telling me you're from the Pacific Northwest. Your academic career, you went to Reed as an undergraduate, and then you went to UT for your PhD. Was there something in between? Was there a master's degree somewhere?
Yeah, I did. I did my master's at NYU, and while I was there, I worked in publishing, in Midtown Publishing, trade publishing.
You're a student of the sort of American Northeastern elite in some respects, but also just sort of New England puritanical culture. The name of the book is Codename Puritan. You talk about Pearson's deep Yankee roots. And I'm curious, just in a sort of contemporary sense, as somebody who didn't, I very much came from this world in one way or another. I grew up in Western Massachusetts, and I went to high school in Connecticut, and I went to Yale, and I lived in New York, and now I'm in Texas. But I mean, I was formed in this world. And I'm curious, when you look out at politics, when you look out at culture, and you think about somebody like Pearson, what's either still with us, maybe in somewhat submerged form that's significant? Or if not that, what is driven by sort of reaction? What's important that's driven in reaction to this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it was a completely foreign world to me, both New England Yankee culture and that sort of ethos about the world, but also elite academia. Like Pearson, my experience is like the level just below elite, right? So looking up and observing and watching, and it was for instance, I just mentioned that I worked in publishing in New York, and so there was, in publishing in New York, the only people who can work in it, because it pays nothing, are people who have family money. And so I was just surrounded by these people who had come out of Yale, Harvard, Princeton, who had family money, who were working here. Interesting, fun, cool people. And so kind of watching them and seeing their folk ways. And also in the process of doing the research for this book, I relocated to New Haven for about 3 months at the start of an academic year because I had to just work in the archives. And the Beinecke Library is located right in the center of the Yale campus. It's got this wonderful patio. And so I would have lunch out there on the patio every day and just listen to the undergraduates as they would go about the sort of start of the year thing, the freshmen figuring out who you are, and then the upperclassmen and talking about what they'd done this summer. And it was so cool to listen to that, and all these like ambitious, smart, highly privileged people.
Were they descendants spiritually of Pearson?
Yes.
And they may have looked very different. They came from different backgrounds.
Exactly. They may be, Chinese American immigrants from San Francisco, but they were like these serious, thoughtful strivers wanting to, like Pearson did, sort of wanting to leverage whatever advantages you have to accomplish what you wanted to accomplish in the world. There was not a lot of, I don't think that would happen out on the Binding Key patio, but I didn't run into a lot of that, the kind of louche, super aristocratic, like, I'm here at Yale because of what I'm going to do, and then I'm going to go into daddy's law firm and all that. But
because they're not around much anymore.
Yeah,
there's such a vanishingly small percentage of the population. I'm sure. I mean, you're talking about a year or two ago, right? I mean, you're talking about
this is 21. Yeah,
there were very few of those people when I was there in the 90s. Yeah, a few of them or something like that. I mean, the ones whose parents have such ungodly amounts of money, and the amount of money you have to give to Yale to get in a sort of unserious person is astronomical at this point.
I would imagine.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I was thinking about. I believe you. I think they are Pearson's spiritual descendants. I think one of the things that people say of the kind of new elite to their detriment vis-a-vis the old elite was, and I'm not sure if I believe this or not, they say, the old elite knew they didn't deserve it, right? The old elite had the sense of noblesse oblige because they were aware that they were aware that they were a sort of hereditary elite, not in a sort of true aristocratic sense, but in some fundamental sense, they were hereditary elite. So part of the sense of noblesse oblige was we didn't get here by virtue of our hard work, right? We got here by virtue of the fact that we're a Lodge or a Vanderbilt or something like that. And so then when they went out in the world to exercise their power, they had a certain sense of obligation to the rest of the world. And I think the accusation about the meritocratic elite is they believe that they deserved it, right? They believe that they achieved these heights because they deserved it, and therefore they've less sense. I'm never sure how I think about that because my peers in those spaces had a very intense sense of public service, or at least the story they would tell of themselves is that they wanted to do good in the world. I would say even most of the ones who went off to work for McKinsey or a big corporate law firm or something like that, the mythology, the self-mythologizing was they had a sense of public service. They so many of them volunteered. And maybe that's still different in some fundamental or some subtle but important sense from noblesse oblige. I'm just not sure I know what the distinction is. All of which is to say, when you're listening to those students, was there some subtle difference in how they talked about their sense of obligation to the world? I mean, whatever. I mean, this is all anecdotal, but I'm just curious your just sort of visceral impression.
It is anecdotal, and in terms of understanding what the students were like that Pearson was around in the 50s and 60s, I can mostly get from the way he talked about it, which he did talk about them a lot. And this is just going to sound cliched, but I think there's a truth to it, that there was, in 99% of the population and probably 100% of the population at Yale, a real sense of joint mission about what the United States, and again, we're talking about a much more homogeneous group of people in the 1950s and 1960s at Yale. But there is a real sense of shared mission and obligation and of so many shared assumptions about what America is about and what America should be doing in the 50s, even if, some of the people are going to go off and sort of be leftist intellectuals. Some of the people are going to go off and be dumbass, corporate lawyers just like daddy. That sense of shared mission, I think,
that's gone.
Began to break apart in Vietnam. And then certainly by the time you and I were in school, it had really kind of dissipated, and now it's utterly gone.
Yeah, it's interesting, and that is a kind of, in some ways, a subtle but important distinction, which is, I think, temperamentally, in so many ways, the students today, and when you and I were in college too, are spiritual descendants at these places, are spiritual descendants of Pearson. But in that sense, in terms of a kind of shared ideology of kind of American exceptionalism or American, mission, that's just gone. And it's just gone, period, because I think even the sort of like the right-wing populist version of it, the America fuck yeah version of it, is just such a different thing. There is, I think, on the right, more of a coherent, shared sense of American supremacy, but not exceptionalism, right? It's more of a kind of nationalist perspective than it is this kind of imperialist, cosmopolitan imperialist perspective. And then there's just so many qualities. I guess last question, I know you have to run, and this is a little bit of a curveball, but not really. Like, and maybe I'm just going to ask every guest this from now on, like, do you think of yourself as a member of the elite? So you're a full professor, right? You're a full professor of English at Duquesne, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, not one of the premier centers of American elite power,
No,
but
definitely not.
A good sized city, relatively.
Yeah, good. We got institute. I mean, I'm at a sub-elite institution in a sub-elite city. I come from a sub-elite class, but yes, I mean, I think so. I think being an academic gives you a degree of cultural capital that's important, that a lot of people still respect. I'm economically fortunate. My wife and I make enough money that we are fairly comfortable. I couldn't have immediate access to, I don't know, major communications. Like I couldn't call up the New York Times and say I'd like to get a piece published.
Right. You can't take a flight to DC and take a bunch of meetings with people, and like as Pearson could his entire life, right?
Yes. I couldn't do that, but I could probably. I know enough people that I could probably cobble together something.
Do you enjoy? So your answer is yes. Do you feel like you are able to enjoy it?
Oh yeah, I am very, very, and my wife and I talk about this a lot. We are very, very grateful for the life that we have the privilege to lead, and as we look out, and we were both in academia, and she's in nursing academia, so it's nowhere near as difficult to find jobs, and although they're cutting back that, but I talk with some of my cohorts who are about my age who are in academia, and like, are we the last generation of people for whom this sort of stereotypically downtrodden, joking American job of the kind of like doofus college English professor, are we the last generation of this that's going to exist? Because it's a good life. It's a good life, and there's a lot of good novels written about us.
Well, I'm glad you enjoy it. I have a sort of simplistic working hypothesis that part of the problem with our country right now is nobody's really able to enjoy victory. The left feels under assault from the right feels under assault from the left. Everybody thinks somebody else is where the power resides, or the influence, or the status. And so we're all kind of, and I'm talking about people, who plausibly could be, I'm not talking about the bottom 80%, but I'm talking about the top 20% who in a lot of cases are also the most influential political actors and cultural actors. Nobody can take the W, right? And like enjoy it.
No, not even the guy in charge right now. So
no, I mean, I feel like
he can't even enjoy it. But he's got so many like inner demons.
Because he can't just say, make this happen, and then it happens. He can't just declare, I want Harvard to cease to exist, and then Harvard ceases to exist. He can't declare that all the professors that, that Greg Barnheisel and Dan Oppenheimer have great respect and esteem for him, and it's not. I mean, I think like it's hard to step back and think about even something as modest as you being on this podcast. With my listeners, I will get 1,000, 1,200 listens or something like that. Like that is a privilege, right? That is a thing that most people in the world, and I get to write for the New York Times sometimes, and you were reviewed in the Wall Street Journal. And like, we are seen and our voice is heard in a way that is extraordinarily rare amongst humanity. And yet, as you said, like we are elite, but in a relatively unglamorous way, right? Right? Like we're not columnists for the New York Times, but but if we can't enjoy it, then that's just like, then we're just fucked because we have it pretty good, which is a weird place to end. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me on the podcast. It's a really fun conversation.
All right. Well, enjoy Pittsburgh. Say hi to Pittsburgh for me.
I will. All right. Thanks, Dan.
This has been another episode of Eminent Americans. Big thanks to my editor, producer extraordinaire, Robert Scaramuccia. Big thanks as well to Alec Ownsworth of Clap Your Hands, Say Yeah, for letting us use his music for our intro and outro. If you liked what you heard, and I imagine you did, if you've made it this deep into the episode, then please rate us on whatever the relevant podcasting platform is. And if you have any questions or comments, email me at djops@gmail.com. That's djopps@gmail.com. I promise to respond at least until the faraway and probably mythical day when I have such a vast audience that I can't in good conscience respond to all the emails while still upholding my responsibility to my loved ones. Have a great day.